Today we're going to work with active versus passive voice. What are the definitions? How can you tell the difference? How should they be used and in what situations? So passive or active, there's an example for the difference here. An active voice would be an active participant. Say, for example, the left-hand picture. You have a basketball player who is actively working in the game. Your passive would be the participants. So you can see all of the thousands of people who are watching the basketball game. They are still part of the game, but they are passively into the game. So what is an active versus a passive verb? Well, voice is an attribute of every verb, so you got to figure out how is the verb being used. Is it in action? Is it actually being used currently? Or versus the passive where we're going to be seeing a lot of the forms of the verb to be. So, many people are confused by whether they're using the active or passive voice when writing, and in which scenario you would actually prefer to use an active voice, and in which scenario you'd want to use a passive voice. So let's stay with that basketball example to further explore passive and active voice. So voice is simply the form that a verb takes to indicate whether the subject of the verb is performing the action or if the verb is receiving the action. So if the verb is performing the action, that is active. So you can see in the picture, Leon Wood dunked the ball. That would be an active verb. A passive verb is receiving the action. The ball here is not the active participant. So when we say the ball was dunked, that is passive. Again, a lot of times when we look at passive voice, you're going to notice an extra verb form of to be along with the verb. The ball was dunked is passive. It is receiving the action. So how do we identify the two styles? Well, there's a simple way. Now, the key to understanding the difference is to spot the subject and the object in each sentence. So depending upon the subject, that's going to be the active. You're going to want to use an active verb if you're trying to make the importance the subject. If the most important thing for you is the object, you're going to want to use the passive verb. So say, for example, our subject, Leon dunked the ball. He's going to get an active verb, dunked. But if the object, the ball, is being the most important here, the ball was dunked, you are going to see passive style. So you want to selectively order the way you introduce them to produce either a passive or an active sentence. So remember, voice is simply the form that a verb takes, and you're deciding whether or not the verb performs it, it's an active verb, or receives the action, a passive verb. So here's your active example. Active, Leon Wood dunked the ball. The verb is dunked. So now you ask, well, who dunked the ball? Well, Leon Wood dunked the ball. What is being dunked? The ball, the object. So since that is not the important part of the sentence, that's not the one we're focusing on, this one is an active voice. Dunked is going back to the who, the subject, Leon Wood. That is active. The passive example, the ball was dunked. The verb is was dunked. So when we ask who dunked the ball in this particular sentence, we don't know. What is being dunked? Well, the ball. The ball is the object here. So the object then has become the subject. It is in passive voice. The ball was dunked. In an active voice sentence, the subject is the element that is doing the action. If the object is the element that is receiving the action, it is being described by the verb, and therefore it is in passive voice. In a passive voice, the element targeted by the action is changed to the subject position. That means the subject is effectively doing nothing because whatever is happening in the verb is being done to it. So the subject is now receiving the action, and that's why it's passive. It is not actively participating. It is receiving the action. Whatever is happening is being done to it. So then why should we use an active voice and why should we use a passive voice? Where do we decide to use these? Well, active voice is more direct and concise, whereas passive voice is usually wordier. Active voice is like watching Leon play, where the passive voice is like watching the game from the stands. Most often, you want to be with the subject, you want to be in control of that verb, so most often you want to use the active voice. More often, you want to be Leon Wood playing, you don't want to be the participant in the stands. So then when or why should I even use the passive voice? Well, perhaps you're trying to hide the subject of the sentence. Maybe you've used it already previously in the paragraph, so now you're going to go ahead and try to hide that subject. You don't want to be redundant or repetitive. When you want to minimize the guilt of the subject, maybe you don't want to give this subject credit. When the use of a passive voice better emphasizes the main point of the message is probably the most times you want to use the passive voice. Again, most often you want to use the active voice. There are times you want to use passive, it's not that often. Usually when the use of a passive voice better emphasizes the main point of the entire message of the paragraph. So passive voice requires a double verb. It will always consist of the form of the verb to be, and the past participle, usually you're going to have an ending of en, ed, or a t form of that particular verb. For example, if you want to use an active verb, Jane baked a cake. She's in past tense, but she's doing the action, so that is an active verb. The cake was baked by Jane. Well, now we've put the cake as the subject, but it is the noun that is having the action happen to it. So we have a passive voice, and take a look at your verb. We're now adding a form of to be, was baked. So that's what we're going to see with passive verbs. You use a double verb, and it will always consist of the form of the verb to be before the verb itself. So what are those active forms of to be? Well, savvy writers should probably know these by now. A lot of times the helper verbs also are called linking verbs. This is going to usually consist of our top 8. Am, is, are, was, were, be, being, and been. There are several different forms of the verb to be, but these are usually what we consider the 8 most common forms of to be. So examples of passive voice for the verb to kick. You can see where we have on the left-hand side, you can see some of the passive forms of to be, like is kicked and was kicked, but they can get pretty long. Helper verbs or linking verbs of to be can actually work with one another, and so you might get very expanded action verbs such as had been kicked, is going to be kicked, will be kicked, can be kicked, should be kicked, was being kicked. All of these verbs on this page are all passive voice. They all have several forms of the verb to be in front of it. They are all passive voice. So let's go ahead and use an example just to kind of review. So a passive voice here, the cookies were being eaten by the children. Well, the children would be the ones who would be actively in the process of eating. The cookies don't eat anything. So because of that form of the verb to be, were, is in front of the verb eaten, and because I'm pretty sure cookies can't actively eat anything, I'm pretty sure that's our passive verb there. Active verb, the children ate the cookies. I don't see a verb form of to be in front of our verb ate. Children can actively eat things, so I have a feeling the children ate the cookies is an active voice. Try another one. The tunnels are dug by the gophers. Well, the gophers are the ones who do the digging. The tunnels are not the ones doing the digging, and I see the form of the verb to be, the word are, in front of our active verb dug. So that is a passive voice verb. The tunnels are dug by the gophers. Well, what's the active? Well, the gophers are doing the digging, so we can just simply say the gophers dug the tunnels. No form of the verb to be there. All right, thanks for stopping by, guys.